Dear students, today we shall discuss the development or lack of development of science and technology in colonial India, that is during the British rule. We will look at why science and technology policy was formulated during the British India, how it brought about social and economic transformation, what are the technological developments that took place during the British India, what are the reasons why the indigenous education system declined, and how the Indian intelligentsia as well as the Indian scientists responded to the colonial policy, which consequently had a bearing on science and technology development in post-independent India. This discussion is based on the article written by Zahir Babbar. The name of the article is Science, Technology and Colonial Power. This is published in an edited book called The Social History of Science in Colonial India, which was edited by S. Irfan Habib and Dhruv Rana. This was published by Oxford University Press in 2009. Now, if we roughly divide the British policies, it can take the shape of two perspectives. The first perspective is the direct or indirect policy which led to the destruction of indigenous education system, and consequently the public work that was initiated on a mass scale by the state in the post Sepoy Mutiny phase, that is post 1857. And the second perspective is the growth of science and technology, development of present scientific structure, and how the Indian scientists, Indian intelligentsia responded to the British policies, the colonial policies on science and technology. The British, when they came to India, they came to India through East India Company. East India Company was ruling parts of India till 1857. Then the India came directly under the rule of the Queen's power. East Indian policy, East Indian Company was more interested in making profit. In order to make profit, whatever they could do to develop the Indian science, technology, agriculture, they did. But essentially their aim was to make money, to gain profit. So hence, there was no structure, there was no organization to the colonial policy during the East India rule in India. There was no systematic policy regarding science and technology development. Whatever was done on the basis of experiment, on basis of trial and error, and that was also done because they were looking at India as a site of experimentation, as a laboratory where all these experiments could be taken up and the results can later be replicated in Britain. The East Indian Company felt that the revenue is on decline, and they wanted to figure out the reasons for decline in the revenue of the East India Company. The reason why they were not getting enough revenue was because of this endowments, rent-free lands that were given for educational purposes. In the early phase of British India, they found that rent-free lands were given to educational institutions. So the revenue generated from these lands went into the maintenance and upkeep of this educational institution. Now, such endowments, such rent-free lands, according to the East India Company, constituted a lot of manipulation, forgery, inefficiency, and they were not in favor of such rent-free land because that was not adding up to the state exchequer. So they decided to resume collection of revenue from those previously rent-free lands. William Adams made series of reports in the early part of 19th century regarding the state, the mode, the extent of indigenous educational system in India. For instance, Thomas Munro, who was the governor of Madras, he in 1822 found that there is not a single village without a school. William Adams' series of reports on the extent and the mode of instructions in indigenous languages, the state of schools, indigenous schools in colonial India, this report showed that almost every village has a school, and this mostly the schools are run or funded by the local king, local ruler, or his representatives. That is one. Or there were instances of schools being run through private funding by wealthy local businessmen. But invariably there was an existence of either pathsalas or madrasas or mathas where indigenous education was imparted. Indigenous education was imparted in astronomy, in Indian physics, in Indian medicine, in Indian astronomy, in Indian mathematics. So as you can see, the indigenous education was imparted through the mathas, through the madrasas, through the pathsalas in the early phase of British rule, which was found by various reports like William Adams' report, and it was mostly in the field of medicine, astronomy, mathematics, literature. Now, but this indigenous system of education of pathsalas, madrasas, they were running thanks to the endowments, thanks to the rent-free lands that were made available to these educational institutions. So the revenue that was generated through these lands, that went into the upkeep and maintenance. The East India Company felt that it is leading to decline in their overall revenue, in their it is not adding up to the state exchequer. So they decided to resume collection of revenue from those lands which were earlier given to the Indian educational institutions. Now that, for instance, led to in Bengal increase of 5 lakh rupees in early part of 19th century. So you can imagine the amount of money that they could generate only in Bengal. There were records of generation, further addition to the state exchequer because of this rule of resuming collection of rent from the previously endowed lands. Now, this had an impact. This had a serious impact on the system of education that was imparted in the Pathsalas and madrasas. You see, these institutions, in the absence of any regular source of money, they closed down, shut down. Hence, indirectly, such policy of East India Company of collecting rent from previously endowed lands meant for education, it led to decline of Indian education system. The indigenous education got a jolt, serious jolt, because of this policy. Over a period of time, all these institutions shut down, or because the patronage to these educational institutions were withdrawn. These local kings, local jamindars, they were under tremendous pressure from the British government to pay additional rent, and which they could do by collecting rent from these places. Hence, they had to withdraw their patronage. That led to, in the early phase of British rule, that led to the decline of indigenous education, and the state policy of withdrawing funding to the Sanskrit colleges or the Mohammedan colleges or madrasas, it led to further decline. And the state also enacted policy of discontinuing printing of books in indigenous languages such as Sanskrit, Persian and Arabic. That led to further decline of indigenous education system. Now, here comes the second part of this discussion, how resumption of collection of interest and revenue from the endowed endowed lands was one issue which led to the decline. Another issue was the famous Macaulay Minutes on that is which led to the introduction of Western science and Western education, instruction in English language in Indian education system. All this further laid the foundation of Western education in India and led to further decline of Indian indigenous education system. Now, here we need to bring the discussion on James Mill and his utilitarian philosophy, how it turned the tide in India as far as the promotion and encouragement and patronage of education in indigenous languages were concerned. Now, James Mill wrote the Magisterial History of British India. In that book, he essentially criticized the Indian education system, the traditional ancient Indian education system, the Indian medicine, Indian mathematics, Indian astronomy, he felt that there is a difference between the Western model of education, the European model of science and education, and the Indian model. He felt it is a difference that of between light and darkness, between truth and error, because Indian education, Indian astronomy, Indian physics, Indian medicine, Indian mathematics, they are all imprecise, inaccurate. It is devoid of reasoning, devoid of logic. It further leads to confusion of mind and leads to religious bigotry and leads to further confusion of mind. Hence, he felt that Indian education system, the traditional Indian education system, needs to stop. And he also developed a philosophy where he felt that he is being located in Britain, he is in a better position to have an objective view of Indian culture and civilization than those administrators who are there in India. He said just because of the fact that he is away from India, it qualifies him to be an objective assessor who can assess and analyze the Indian culture and civilization. He developed the Utilitarian Philosophy, where the basic argument is that the good practices have solid foundation in sound theory, that is, he also felt his idea was to formulate a liberal program to emancipate India from its own culture. That is, he felt since Indian mathematics, Indian astronomy, Indian medicine, they are all devoid of reason, devoid of logic, is full of error, is imprecise, inaccurate. Hence, he must develop a system of education that should be introduced in India that would liberate India, emancipate India from its own culture, from its own civilization. And his idea was to test his theory by, he said that I can always come up with universally applicable laws irrespective of the culture, social context, time, and he felt that India constitutes that practical experimentation site for his utilitarian philosophy, that whatever principle or ideas he had developed in history of British India and which he felt should be implemented, he said, let us do that using India as an experimental site. And he said that one can always come up with universally applicable laws which is irrespective of local variation, and these laws can be applied, implemented in practical experimental sites successfully. So his agenda was very simple, to put utilitarian philosophy into practice, and for that he found India as a good testing ground. And to add to it, he was involved with East India Company from 1828 onwards. In fact, by 1830 he became the chief examiner, a position, highest position in East India Company, who could take important decisions regarding policy matters in India. And William Bentinck, the Governor General who came to India during that time, for him Mill's book of History of British India, it was a standard textbook. Many of the colonial administrators who came to India during that time, they all came to India having read James Mill's book on History of British India. For them it was a standard textbook, like a Bible. If you want to come to India, you must read that book. And hence all of these people around that time, 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, they were heavily inspired and influenced by James Mill philosophy of utilitarianism. And they all subscribed to the view, all these administrators who came to India, they subscribed to the view that Indian education system, the indigenous education, is inaccurate and imprecise. It is no match to the practical, reasoning based Western model of science. Now, because of that, there was a change because of James Mill's intervention, his impact on the colonial administrators. There was a change in policy. When William Bentinck came to India, also another person who joined him is Thomas Babington Macaulay. Now, Macaulay was part of those Anglicists who felt that Indian education, indigenous learning has to be discontinued. The medium of instruction has to be English. There has to be an introduction of Western science in Indian education system. Hence, he essentially was arguing for introduction of English language as a medium of instruction in educational institutions. Now, contrary to what these Anglicists were saying, there were also the Orientalists such as H.T. Wilson, H.H. Prinsep, William Jones. They all felt that the indigenous languages needs to be protected. They felt that education should be imparted in indigenous languages such as Persian or Sanskrit or Arabic, so as to preserve and to understand the importance and the beauty of ancient Indian mathematics, ancient Indian medicine, ancient Indian astronomy, and Indian literature. In the initial part of the debate and argument regarding the introduction of Western science and introduction of English as a medium of instruction, the Orientalist had a powerful lobby. The Orientalists such as William Jones, H.T. Prinsep, H.H. Wilson, all these people argued vociferously in favor of continuation of indigenous languages like Sanskrit, like Arabic, like in Persian. But those administrators who came to India in 1830s, William Bentinck, the Governor General, Macaulay, Thomas Macaulay, all these who were inspired by utilitarian philosophy of James Mill, they felt otherwise. Since they were in a position of power and position of authority, so over a period of time their view prevailed, leading to the famous Macaulay report of 1835. Macaulay minutes, where English as a medium of instruction was formally introduced. One of the reasons for that was that there was a heavy shortage of employees at the lower rungs of British administration. They felt that if English as a language can be imparted to the natives, then those posts which are lying vacant in the lower rungs of Indian administration, they can be filled up, and it would be easier for the East India Company to govern the country with English educated natives. That was one. Second reasoning was that by imparting Western science and English as a medium of instruction, they'll have better control over India. That will secure their rights over the India. So they felt with this they'll be able to fill up the lower rungs of British administration by introducing English, and with that they will be able to govern better. They will have more control. Hence, the English as a language was introduced in the Indian education system. Now, with that, it struck at the very root of Indian education, indigenous education system. With English coming in, state patronage to English language learning, it led to decline of indigenous education. It also led to discontinuation, stopping of printing of books in Indian languages of Persian, Arabic and Sanskrit. Those, of course, Orientalists were not completely out of the picture. Because of their demand, here and there, once in a while, the government, that is government under East India Company, would grant some amount for setting up of a madrasa or setting up of a Sanskrit college, or would grant a minuscule amount for printing of books in indigenous languages. For instance, in 1839, at the behest of the Orientalist Lord Auckland, who was the Governor General around that time, he set aside £3,000 for support of indigenous languages and indigenous educational institutions, compared to £24,000 that was earmarked for development of English and Western model of science education in India. So that is a kind of difference. Almost 8 times more money was earmarked for development of Western model of education in India, whereas only £3,000 in 1839 earmarked for development of or setting up of indigenous educational institutions or printing of books. Now, this was the state of affairs till 1830s, 1840s. Then around that time there was a lobby for introduction of railways, telegraph and reformed postal system. This lobby was basically a reaction to the industrialization that was taking place at a massive scale, in Britain, and the advantages that they could get out of it. One of the reasons, for instance, why railways was introduced in India was because of the cotton famine of 1846 in US. So the British manufacturers sitting in Lancashire, Manchester, Liverpool, Dundee, they did not get sufficient raw material from US in the form of cotton. The cotton famine at United States led the British to look towards the east. They felt that if railways could be introduced in India, then this cotton which were being planted and produced and cultivated in Deccan region could easily go to the nearest ports of Madras, of Bombay, and that could be sent to the Britain, and it could be manufactured, and the manufactured products can come back to India, which would lead to more profit for the East India Company. So that was one of the reasons why railways was introduced in India. The railways was also introduced because of the pressure from the missionaries. They felt with the introduction of railways, they would be able to strike at the root at the caste system, and thereby it will be easier for them to convert the Indians, the Hindus, into Christians. So for the missionaries, the aim was to convert more people into Christianity. For the British, the reason was twofold. Because of a cotton famine in US, they were looking for introduction of railway line in India, so that the cotton can be transferred and transported to the ports very quickly. Also, there was a military interest. They felt that with introduction of railways, it would be easier for the government to have law and order maintained all over the country. So railways was introduced in 1849. Telegraph was introduced in 1850 for faster communication system, and postal system was also reformed. For them, these are the reasons why science and technology could transform the Indian economy and Indian society, and also led to tremendous improvement in British. In fact, it led to more profit being made by the British from India as a colony. Now, around that time, also they turned their attention to irrigation projects. Reason? Declining revenue from agriculture. So declining revenue from agriculture led them to think that there has to be something has to be done to improve the agriculture system, which would lead to more revenue and more profit for the East India Company. Hence, they also introduced the Canal Project. Now, the Britain did not have any canals, so they were not very much familiar with this canal engineering. Hence, Lieutenant Baird Smith, he established a civil engineering college in Roorkee in 1845, which was renamed as Thomason Engineering College in 1847. They wanted to train the natives in civil engineering so that they do not have to import the military engineers from Britain. That was not cost effective. So they wanted the locals to be trained so that it would be cost effective for them. At the same time, it would be easier to communicate to the laborers. The Indian native civil engineers could communicate to the laborers in their own languages. That would help execute the project. Hence, Ganga Canal Project was introduced and Civil Engineering College was established at Roorkee in 1847. Idea was to generate more revenue through canal irrigation, and that was indirectly the foundation for the science and technology development in India. Now, I will continue discussing the development of science and technology in the post 1857 era, which is the era of constructive imperialism and the response of Indian intelligentsia and the Indian scientists to the British colonial policies. Thank you.